Welcome to Echoes of Jewish History, where memory meets meaning. I'm your host, Jimmy Bitton. Together we'll explore the stories, struggles, and ideas that have shaped the Jewish people across time and around the world. From biblical origins to modern Israel, from exile to resilience, this is our journey. Before we begin, I want to pause and thank you, my listeners, the growing community of Echoes of Jewish History. This project started as an idea, but it's your curiosity, your encouragement, and your commitment to remembering and learning that have made it real. I'm grateful you're here, and I'm honored to share this journey with you. There are moments in history when the world does not simply ignore Jewish pain, it erases it in real time. Not with the silence of distance, but with the noise of denial, deflection, and moral equivalence. Since October 7th, we have lived through one of those moments. In its aftermath, Jews across the globe have not only faced the trauma of unprecedented brutality, but the bewildering sting of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that our grief doesn't matter. We have seen this before in 1943, even as reports of the mass slaughter of European Jewry reached the free world. Allied leaders hesitated to act. Newspapers buried the headlines, and some openly questioned the truth of what they heard. The killing continued, and the survivors returned to find their pleas for help had been met with polite disbelief. The pattern is painfully familiar. A Jewish cry for life met with the world's calculated shrug. That second wound is harder to name until now. Today I'm joined by Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern, a Harvard-trained clinical psychologist, trauma specialist, and researcher, who together with her colleague Jacqueline Wolfman was the first to apply the established concept of traumatic invalidation to Jewish experience and to examine its consequences in a systematic way. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals and discussed worldwide, giving a language to the experience of having your deepest wounds met with silence or denial. But her expertise goes beyond the academic. Dr. Bar-Halpern grew up during the Second Intifada, has worked extensively with families impacted by hate and radicalization through Parents for Peace, and now leads clinical efforts to help communities confront hard truths without tearing each other apart. In this conversation, we'll talk about why silence after trauma can be as damaging as the trauma itself. We'll explore how to build trauma-informed communities that bridge political and cultural divides, how to hold space for multiple truths, and how to rebuild trust through validation rather than polarization. And we'll leave you with practical skills, tools you can use to support parents, students, and neighbors in an age when listening well is as rare as it is necessary. Dr. Bar-Halpern, you've written about traumatic invalidation as a wound that can be as damaging as the trauma itself. Take us back. When did you first begin to notice this pattern? And how did your personal journey from growing up during the Second Intifada to becoming a clinical leader in the U.S. shape your perspective as a Jew?
Hi, Jimmy. Thank you so much for having me today. To answer these questions, we will need to go back to October 7th. I woke up to multiple missed calls and SMS from my family and friends in Israel, panicking and not knowing what's happening, and also phone calls from friends here in the U.S. in complete shock and fear. My instinct was to write a post in the Massachusetts Israeli Facebook group with my cell phone number and offer support. I was flooded with phone calls and quickly was able to mobilize a team of Hebrew-speaking clinicians that provided pro bono support for the community. And we did that for over a year. It was one-on-one, groups, webinars, seminars. If there was a need, we were there. And a few things happened that led me to notice this pattern. On October 8th, while we were still counting bodies in Israel, Harvard already blamed Israel for the attack of the 7th, followed by other universities in Massachusetts and around the US. And I also noticed that the media is painting a very different picture for what I know is happening and for my family and friends in Israel, while my colleagues and friends started to ask questions or make statements that made me feel like I'm going crazy. I remember literally telling my husband at some point, I think that I'm crazy and that everything I grew up on was a lie. It's a very disturbing feeling, and I had to go through a deep dive of reading actual books, not TikTok, to make sure that I remember my history and my lived experience accurately and that I'm not crazy. At the same time, I've been noticing that the people that I started helping after October 7th, the ones from the community, show similar symptoms and were making similar statements to my non-Jewish trauma clients at my clinic, such as my feelings don't matter, I feel betrayed, I have no one to trust, people don't care about my pain, they are blaming me for what happened in Gaza. And this became a pattern with almost every person I spoke with from the Jewish community. So I started to collect the stories and noticed that it applies to the traumatic invalidation framework, which I didn't invent. It's a known term from the dialectical behavioral therapy trauma world. It was coined by Marsha Linehan and was researched by Melanie Harney and others. And Dr. Wolfman, who is a colleague from McLean, heard about the work I was doing in the community and offered to help, and we decided to publish on this topic. We didn't expect it to go viral, but as it is now one of the most read academic papers across all disciplines, I think it speaks to the need of the community to name the wound, to give language. It is part of the healing. And then to your other question, my personal journey as someone who grew up during the Second Intifada plays a big role to who I am today in my career choices. As you mentioned, I was born and raised in Israel, and I devoted my career to understanding and treating trauma. Growing up in Israel, trauma wasn't something we talked about. The fear and uncertainty were just part of my life. I prayed every time I boarded a bus, was today the day it would explode, or when you sit in a restaurant, you never sit close to the window because if there is an attack, the window is going to explode on you. Opening the newspaper, you look at names of people who died and you're just searching to see if you know anybody. It was always part of my life. So every home in Israel has a safe room, every playground has a shelter, and missiles are just part of the routine. In my generation, it was only a matter of time before someone I knew wouldn't come back. I immigrated to the U.S. for my doctorate, and suddenly my past stood out like scars I've never noticed before. Only during my studies I realized how unique my experience were. For my dissertation, I focused on trauma from terrorism and created a therapy book for children that were impacted by violence. I met my husband, who's not Jewish, but he carries his own family trauma when he lost his father in 9/11, and that gave me a new perspective on my past. Together, we built a life with our 2 children, both of whom we nearly lost to medical complication. But for me, my coping is that I'm a doer. When my kids were in coma, I wrote a handout for parents who were in similar situation based on coping skills. Doing is the best antidote for trauma, and helping others became my way of coping and my purpose. So on October 7th, 2023, everything I thought I'd buried resurfaced. And suddenly I was worried about my family in Israel and my children here. The power of doing literally saved me. And now I'm just driven to create spaces where trauma can meet healing and where our stories of fear and resilience can really foster a better world. I'm doing it because of my history, as a granddaughter of Holocaust survivor, and I do it for my kids.
For listeners who've heard of trauma but not traumatic invalidation, how would you define it in the specific context of Jewish experience after October 7th?
Traumatic invalidation is the extreme or ongoing lack of understanding or ignoring or criticizing of people's experiences or aspects of themselves. It can include denial, lack of understanding, blaming, putting down, or ignoring someone's experiences by important person or group or authority. And it can really lead to changes in the way we think about ourselves, others, and the world. It is a social trauma that can create an existential crisis because we cannot survive without our group. So when someone is threatened with being rejected by the group, it can really feel like it's a life or death situation. Some examples that are related to the Jewish community include when you go according to the different criteria. So ignoring, when people are posting on other groups but not about Jewish people, or the silence after the sexual assault or after October 7th. And the message is you don't matter and your Jewish identity is not important. For emotional neglect, we see that sometimes people are sharing their pain. The response is, how do you think the Palestinians are feeling? Or we need to raise their voices, as if our grieving for our people is hurting other people as well. And the message is your suffering doesn't matter and you're unlovable. With criticizing, we see a lot of slurs like you're dirty Zionist, you should be fired, and the message is you're bad and unacceptable, and the Jewish people are bad and unacceptable. Blaming happens a lot with the Israeli immigrants in the US and Canada when they're being blamed for the government of Israel action or they're being asked to defend it. So the message you're getting is that the problem is your fault and you caused trouble. Misinterpreting is when you express agony or expressing your emotions, you're being seen as too emotional, or you made others feel uncomfortable, or the assumption that if I'm Israeli, I automatically against Palestinian people. In fact, now when I give talks around the US, I start by saying I'm pro-Israeli and I'm pro-Palestinian. I'm just not pro-Hamas. And it's always interesting to me as a trauma therapist that people assume just because I'm Israeli that I don't care about Palestinians or that I want this war to continue. As a human being, obviously, I do not. Denying reality, that happens from therapists as well. When patients are telling them, I don't feel safe or I feel hypervigilant because of the rise of anti-Semitism, some therapists said to their clients, oh, it's just a small group, or, you're just overreacting. So the message we're getting is you're crazy and you cannot be trusted. Controlling is when we're being told what is or isn't anti-Semitic, and the message is your way of being is wrong, or you need to change. Another example of controlling is when someone is being told, just be less Jewy, don't be so Jewish in front of people. Excluding happened a lot on college campuses when students are being bullied online and on school or not invited to social activities just because they're Jewish. And some decided to hide their identity because of that, which can lead to feeling of shame and loneliness and being unlovable. There was actually a list of therapists that was created in Chicago, and it says Zionist therapists to avoid and not to refer to. And also listservs and conferences deny access for some Jewish professional or ask them to leave consultation team. So the message is you do not belong and you're unwanted.
I see.
And then unequal treatment is when people are just not mentioning the hostages or victim of October 7th or the victim of the sexual violence. They can hold a minute of silence for the people in Gaza in conferences, but they will not do the same for the Jewish people. So the message we're getting is that you're a second-class citizen and you're just not important.
I see. So historically, the Jewish people have faced not just persecution, but denial of that persecution. How does today's invalidation fit into that long historical pattern?
It's not new. In Jewish history, harm has usually come with a story that denies the harm. Today, the packaging looks different. Words like context, neutrality, or policy that sounds principled, but often erases what happened. Think whataboutism the minute Jews are targeted. Calling intimidation, dialogue, or statements that won't say Jewish or good Jews versus Zionist Jews. That just justify exclusion. Social media pours gasoline on it, turning old labels into echo chambers of hate. Psychologically, that's a second wound. Traumatic invalidation, it creates moral injury, makes one's safe spaces feel unsafe, and erodes trust. So how does today fit in this pattern? The same playbook, new tools to make Jewish pain unspeakable. Today the word is anti-Zionism. It's the same wound, since Zionism is a core part of Jewish identity. The majority of Jews see themselves as Zionist. So when someone denies or vilify or blame this part of your identity, it causes harm. Our job is to keep it speakable, to pair accountability with care, and to make sure that Jews don't have to perform perfect victimhood to deserve safety and belonging.
Right, and on today's university campuses, legitimacy is too often distributed through what we could call here sort of victimhood currency or a victimhood currency dialectic. So in this framework, the more convincingly a group can present itself as a victim of oppression, the more moral authority it claims in the public square. So this dialectic is not neutral. It rewards powerlessness and elevates suffering into a kind of social capital. But the problem is the framework collides head on with the Jewish experience after 1948. So with the rebirth of the state of Israel, Jewish history took a decisive turn away from helplessness. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews re-entered the stage of history, not as passive victims, but as agents of their own destiny. So that sovereignty, that resilience runs directly against the logic of victimhood currency. So it is precisely this contradiction that fuels so much of the hostility we see towards Jews and Israel on campus, I believe. Jews do not conform to the script. We cannot be slotted neatly into the hierarchy of victimhood, and our empowerment unsettles a system that depends on weakness as its measure for moral worth. So traumatic invalidation isn't really new in Jewish history. Do you see any parallels between the current moment and other moments when Jews had to build resilience in the face of global indifference?
Of course, there are clear parallels. We need to take into account intergenerational trauma. We do not come to this world clean from past experiences. Multiple studies show that epigenetic plays a role in trauma transmission, which means that some of us are more vulnerable to stressful events and to trauma. But we're also resilient. We inherit protective tools: faith and ritual as nervous system anchors, peoplehood, purpose, study, humor, tikkun olam, and collective care. In medieval Europe, communities built mutual aid and safety nest. After pogroms or after the Shoah, communities rebuilt institution and turned pain into organizing movement. Each era paired harm or indifference, and each time Jews answered with care inside the community and advocacy outside of it. What does it mean now? We need to name the harm before debating it. We need to create peer care and reporting channels on campuses, at work. We need to practice small daily regulation like breathing and boundaries and media limits. And we need to take agency where we can. Clear safety policies, bystander and upstander protocols, coalition work, storytelling, anything that keep the Jewish experiences speakable. It's at both ends. Vulnerability is real, and resilience is practiced. More than that, we can shift the needle from resilience to post-traumatic growth by giving meaning to these difficult events and even grow in the face of trauma. Not erasing it, but evolving from it.
You've said silence after trauma can wound as deeply as the original event. What does that silence mean to the Jewish community, especially in a time when many of us assumed our pain would be recognized?
So in my opinion, silence isn't neutral. It's actually taking a stand. To a community in pain, it reads as your suffering and your belonging is conditional. Your safety is negotiable. For many Jews that were raised on the promise that never again meant broad recognition, that gap between expectation and response is painful. Psychologically, silence creates moral injury and institutional betrayal. It turned classroom or workplaces into places of loss. We are still there, but we don't longer feel safe. People get hypervigilant, self-censor, avoid spaces, and trust your odds. It also wakes up intergenerational memory, because we've seen this movie before. That question of who will hide me and who will protect me is something that we know very well from our grandparents. When our pain is witnessed and named, we can stay engaged. But when we're met with silence, we disappear. And it adds to the dehumanization of Jews.
I have my theories, but from your vantage point, what's behind the refusal to acknowledge Jewish suffering today? Is it political fear, moral confusion, or something deeper in society's relationship to Jews?
Short answer? It's all three and they stack. The first layer, the political fear. Leaders worry about alienating coalition or turning donors, so they send down language. There is a whataboutism instead of naming Jewish harm. The second layer is moral confusion. These simple oppressor-oppressed lens codes Jews are seeing as powerful or privileged, so then vulnerability gets added out. The empathy turns into zero-sum. If I validate your pain, it means that I'm taking a side. This hierarchy of empathy makes us lose our humanity. And unfortunately, the data shows that social justice movements have been taken over by false ideologies. Just track money back to Qatar. So it's been in our school system around elementary school. And we're seeing the result on college campuses where people are chanting, thinking that they're on the right side of history without understanding nuances. It's the Western wall trying to westernize the Middle East, and by doing so, justifying terrorists as freedom fighters. It's absurd, but it's the result of years of brainwashing in education. And then the third layer, which is the deep stuff, all tropes with new outfits. The idea that Jewish suffering is suspect, explainable, conditional, just prove you're right kind of Jew first, that still circulates. Add human psychology, world bias, cognitive dissonance, conformity, and social media on top of that to spread more hate, and you have the perfect storm. On a side note, I also think that people, especially liberal people who fight for social justice, they just had to figure out a way to justify the brutality of Hamas, because it reflects on their own belief that Israelis are bad. And due to this cognitive dissonance, they double down on dehumanizing Jews. And you can see it with the red posters of the hostages. Those are pictures of women and babies and children, civilians. And it's almost as those people had to not see them in front of them, make it not real, so they can still believe their narrative and still believe that they're on the right side of history and that Israelis are bad and at fault.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this cognitive dissonance explains much of the radical left's obsession with Israel. To admit the truth about Hamas, that it is a death cult of genocidal theocrats, would unravel their entire moral edifice. So they've built their identity around the fantasy that Jews reborn in their land are the oppressors and that Hamas, drenched in blood, are the victims. When the evidence screams otherwise, when Hamas slaughters children in the name of God, the ideology cannot bend, so it doubles down. What we are witnessing on the radical left is not a principled critique, but a pathology. A movement so enthralled by its narrative that it cannot repent, even when confronted with horror. And so it turns its fury not against evil, but against those who expose it. So Miri, you work with Parents for Peace, helping families impacted by hate and radicalization. What lessons from that work are most relevant for Jewish families navigating rising anti-Semitism and post-October 7 invalidation?
So Parents for Peace is an amazing organization. It's a non-Jewish organization. I'm actually the only Jew there. And they heard me in one of my talks and told me that I do not need to fight alone. My colleagues were people who were once addicted to hate. I worked with the former neo-Nazi, former Islamists, people who escaped radicalized home, Morocco, Iran. And what I've learned from working with them is that anti-Semitism, it's not just a Jewish problem. It's a non-Jew problem that is affecting Jews, but it's affecting everybody else. It is actually the gateway to extremism. It makes people more vulnerable of hating other groups, and it's actually the connective tissue across all extreme ideologies. The majority of the phone calls we're getting to our helpline, where people call to ask for support for their loved ones that a word has been radicalized, include anti-Semitic content, from the far left to the far right. So what Jewish families need to know is that we need to fight together against radicalization, and we need allies, because anti-Semitism is affecting them as well. For families that experience internal anti-Semitism, I would say lean in with curiosity, not judgment. Don't shame your child, rather try to understand where they're coming from. Validation is not an agreement. Open the door for discussion instead of alienating them. Only by having uncomfortable conversation in a safe manner, we can actually change minds.
I couldn't agree with you more. Anti-Semitism has always been more revealing about the society that harbors it than about the Jews themselves. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, blessed memory, wrote that the hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. Because anti-Semitism is not only a prejudice against a people, but a symptom of a deeper moral sickness within a culture. A healthy society builds on self-confidence, tolerance, and a search for truth. A sick one looks for scapegoats to cover its failures. From the Torah onward, Jewish wisdom teaches that hatred corrodes the hater before it ever damages the hated. As the Chachamim, the sages said, sinat chinam, baseless hatred, was destructive enough to bring down the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. So when anti-Semitism reappears, it tells us less about Jews than it does about the cracks within a civilization. Its inability to bear difference, its loss of moral clarity, its surrender to fear and resentment. It sounds very familiar to us today. So anti-Semitism is not only an attack on Jews, it is, as Jonathan Sacks also said, an early warning sign of a society in decline. Jewish parents are now preparing their children not only for the threat of anti-Semitism, but for the emotional whiplash when their pain is dismissed or polarized. What guidance can you offer them?
The first thing that comes to my mind is to do a cope ahead plan. Talk with your child about situation where it might happen and what can they do. Who is their safe person? Who to report? How to report? When to react, but also when not to react. Safety is first. So if they're not feeling physically safe, they should not get into a debate. You can even role play with them answers or identify a situation that can be more difficult. And if they share a situation with you, the first thing you want to do is to validate them. Say something like, I'm sorry this happened. I believe you. You really don't have to convince me. Let's make a plan together. Use curiosity to get more information and help them to come up with a plan that makes them feel supported and in control. And also follow up, close the loop with them. You want to help them name it, teach the difference between critique and humanization. You can help them say, this wasn't a debate, this was anti-Semitic, or this was invalidating. Practice with them skills to regulate in situation of distress. And actually, this can help the family as a whole to regulate emotion, to calm down the nervous system. And all of us should really limit our social media. It's really difficult, me as well, but knowing which content to consume and how much is really important. Help them set clear boundaries about who to unfollow and how much time to spend online. I mean, we can't expect them to do this on their own. We're having problem as adults to do that. And finally, I would say connecting them to a community. The power of belonging is important. Being with others where they can feel safe to show their intersectionality of the identity and celebrate it with pride. I can't stress this enough.
We're coming to the end of our interview. It's been a real pleasure, Miri. Looking ahead, what gives you hope that Jewish grief and trauma will be met with recognition rather than denial in the future?
More people now have the language for what's been happening, traumatic invalidation. And once you can name a wound, you can stop repeating it. Survivors, students, clinicians, and allies are telling Jewish stories in ways that stick. And institutions are slowly moving from statements to protocols. Pre-commitments about what we'll say when harm happens, clear boundaries on intimidation, real reporting and repair. I'm also seeing cross-community coalition. Non-Jewish organizations such as Parents for Peace or the American Muslim and Multi-Faith Women Empowerment Council are doing more than bearing witness. They have a call for action and are taking action and asking others to join them. That gives me hope and reminds me that I'm not alone. On the grounds, families and educators are building muscle memory. Name the harm, validate the experience, protect safety, then debate. That sequence is teachable, repeatable, and contagious. In Massachusetts, there is a special committee to combat anti-Semitism in the State House, and they just came with official recommendations for the K-12, and includes my testimony about this topic. This gives me hope that my kids will be protected. So yes, grief will still come, but the circle is widening and more hands meet it. More voices say, I see you. We're learning to witness without a hierarchy of pain, to meet people as people, not as problems. People are learning to listen before responding, and more becoming upstanders, fighting with us and for us. Listen, hope connects all of us. When we sing Hatikva, the hope, we stand tall and we stand united. We're not alone, and we're not going anywhere.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of Jewish History. If this episode brought new insight or raised new questions, I invite you to share it, reflect on it, and continue the conversation. Mostly to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe. I'm Jimmy Bitton, and as always, may our memory lead us to meaning and our past illuminate our path forward.